adaptation, sustainable development goals, and disaster risk reduction go hand in hand. Ideally, in a governance system that should go hand in hand, but that is not what is going on. There is financial gaps. Of course, Bay of Bengal has been known for cyclones for the longest period of time. We always thought of it as a cyclone-prone region, and there is no doubt about it. Even before the climate conversation started, we know that this region has faced multiple cyclones, very deadly cyclones, which has had a lot of political ramifications as well, starting with the Bhola cyclone, or Nargis in Myanmar, Bhola in Bangladesh. So some of these cyclones have had large political implications as well for the region. I think critical infrastructure is another, like you have a lot of military infrastructure across this region, energy infrastructure, of course, cyber infrastructure, undersea cables, so many of these can also, with the especially the sea surface temperatures rising, or the sea temperatures rising, this could also affect the various infrastructure that is, below the sea. And also, with the kind of changes, it could also affect the infrastructure that is on the coast, in the coastal areas itself, on the coast.
Greetings, listeners, and welcome to our podcast series, Reimagining the Bay of Bengal, presented by Asian Confluence. And I'm your host, Neeraj. Today, we are examining how climate change is reshaping security in the region, not through traditional military threats, but through rising seas, extreme weather, and cascading risks that challenge stability and livelihood. Asian Confluence has established the Center of Bay of Bengal Studies in Shillong to promote research, dialogue, and collaboration on the region's shared future. So, in this particular episode, we are exploring climate change and non traditional security threats in the Bay of Bengal. As always, we'll unpack this through 5 thought provoking questions designed to spark clarity and inspire conversation. We are joined today by Dr. Dhanashree Jayaram, who is a senior assistant professor in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, India. She is also coordinator of Center of Climate Studies. She is a research fellow with the Earth System Governance Network and a climate security expert network, and has held prestigious fellowships including Alexander von Humboldt International Climate Protection Fellowship at Berlin. Her research area focuses on environmental and climate security, climate diplomacy, environmental geopolitics in Southern Asia and Indo-Pacific, and the geopolitical implication of solar geoengineering. Dr. Dhanashree, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Neeraj.
Thank you. So just to begin our conversation, I just want to, begin by clarifying the concept itself. So my first question to you, that how would you conceptualize non-traditional security threats? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think, that's a good way to start this conversation, because I think especially today when we are living in this very geopolitically turbulent times, I don't know if it makes sense to even distinguish between traditional and non-traditional, or human and national, various types of security threats that we talk about. I think there was a time when it made sense to, especially from a policy or governance perspective, what needs to be treated as traditional, or what needs to be treated as more urgent security concerns, and what can be considered less important or second order security concerns, which usually get clubbed as this non-traditional security threats. So traditional security threats are much easier to define, because those are like military related threats, even nuclear or counterterrorism. So these are some of the issues that usually get grouped under traditional security threats. And of course, external threats. Threats from other states or non-state actors. So it's easier to define traditional security threats. While it comes to non-traditional security threats, what are the concerns that come under this larger bracket? So usually we say climate, environmental threats, food security, water security, energy security. But look at what's going on today. I don't think energy security can be considered just a non-traditional or less important security concern within the larger gamut of security calculus, right? So I think for some time this misunderstanding as far as how do we really categorize threats into non-traditional or traditional was always there. But I think today the lines are very blurred. it's not like something is traditional, something is non-traditional, because the war in the Middle East today, West Asia, is clearly sort of spilling into all kinds of sectors, all kinds of security sectors. And in the past couple of decades, what we have also seen is that overall, these kind of lines are getting blurred more and more, even in the policy circles. Security architectures are recognizing the fact that, you cannot really separate one security from another security. Especially, we are looking at different kinds of terminologies being used, like poly crisis, multiple crisis, systemic crisis. So when we are talking about such kind of crisis, and of course, different types of security risks that we are facing, that's the way I look at security today, as a more comprehensive, holistic sort of perspective that we need. And we also need to broaden the security sectors that we have, which are all interlinked with each other. So the military is also affected by environmental security, which is something that I work on. So it's not possible to, like distinguish or separate one from the other, which I think has led to a lot of, inappropriate policies in the past. We need to learn from those mistakes and see how we can conceptualize these security risks better, and have responses which address the 21st century like grand challenges that we face today.
So that's really a very clear understanding and a very useful framing which you have highlighted, and it also help us to see that how climate risk are actually, it has blurred the line between the security and the survival. Now I would come to the Bay, because the Bay is also the home to some of the world most climate vulnerable coastline. So my question is to you, that how do climate change induced risk threatens the security of coastal and littoral states? What's your take on it?
Yeah, so the Bay of Bengal is, again, it's been ignored in the larger conversation of the Indian Ocean, and because of course Indian Ocean consists of so many different sub-regional sort of geographies as well. Of course, Bay of Bengal has been known for cyclones for the longest period of time. We always thought of it as a cyclone-prone region, and there is no doubt about it. Even before the climate conversation started, we know that this region has faced multiple cyclones, very deadly cyclones, which has had a lot of political ramifications as well, starting with the Bhola cyclone, or Nargis in Myanmar, Bhola in Bangladesh. So some of these cyclones have had large political implications as well for the region. What does climate change now do? What is the risk multiplier or threat multiplier, or whatever the language that is used? You usually don't like using the term threat multiplier, but what does climate change then add to the burden of these countries? Of course, what we may not see an uptick in the number of cyclones, because we've seen cyclones before as well. But what we are seeing is that cyclones are becoming more intense. They are becoming stronger, and they are creating more damages. Now, most of the countries in the region have learned, experiential learning is something that makes, societies, communities, states more prepared for these kind of disasters. Hence, you see that the number of deaths has reduced over time. Bangladesh, India, particularly, are very good examples of countries that have very good, like, very robust, like disaster risk reduction or disaster management, if not risk reduction, at least disaster management architectures. But what we're seeing is the economic damages, the physical infrastructure damages have increased, and they have skyrocketed. And that is because, of course, these countries are developing, and there's like economic implications become much higher in developing countries that also have weaknesses as far as physical infrastructure is concerned, governance mechanisms are concerned, political stability is concerned. So all these different aspects affect your preparedness. Um, I think sea level rise is something that, of course, there is variability. Like recent studies have shown that it has risen much more than before. I mean, in terms of the data itself, there is less clarity, or there is not like clear sort of data on how much the seas have risen in particular, like regions like the Bay of Bengal. But we know that sea level rise is an impending risk for all the countries, and we are already seeing the effects of that in the Sundarbans, for instance, which is shared by India and Bangladesh. We are seeing migration as a pattern of that, demographic changes within the coastal areas, in cyclone affected areas, in areas affected by saltwater intrusion, by sea level rise, storm surges. Many of these issues are common across the region. So these are some of the common challenges that are very much what we see across the region. But I think it also depends, like I said, on governance structures, on economic, political stability. And this is where, of course, some countries are more vulnerable because, you may not have like sustainable kind of patterns of, governance structures that would address these concerns over a period of time. So yeah, so I mean, fisheries is a major sector, which is, it's a major part of the economic, growth or development of all the countries in the region, and we are already seeing the effects of climate change on fisheries. Um, I mean, which also has these ripple effects, as we can see on, how fishing communities are then forced to go into waters beyond their territorial waters, and then getting into trouble. This causes conflicts between countries. We have seen conflicts between India and Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Myanmar. So such kind of conflicts have existed for a long time. But now with climate change, there is depletion that is already happening. I mean, this is also related to illegal, overfishing, unreported fishing, which is also going on in the region. So, we cannot treat climate change in silo. It's happening in tandem with all these human interventions that are aggravating the situation further. Agriculture is another sector. Coastal agriculture across the region is getting affected, especially with saltwater intrusion. There are some solutions that countries have come up with, like in Bangladesh or even in India. You can see some solutions to deal with this saltwater intrusion, particularly community led solutions like floating farms, etc. But again, these are not sustainable enough considering the large scale impacts of this is going to have on the aquifers, on the groundwater of entire coastal area. Coastal erosion is a problem. You cannot expect the entire region to adapt to sea level rise or storm surges by just building like sea walls everywhere. Mangroves is a good solution, but again, it has to go hand in hand with grey infrastructure and see how this can protect communities from the various vagaries of climate change. I think critical infrastructure is another. Like you have a lot of military infrastructure across this region, energy infrastructure, of course, cyber infrastructure, undersea cables. So many of these can also, with the especially the sea surface temperatures rising or the sea temperatures rising, this could also affect the various infrastructure that is below the sea. And also, with the kind of changes, it could also affect the infrastructure that is on the coast, in the coastal areas itself, on the coast. So, we have seen in the past, Cyclone Hudhud, for instance, affecting Vishakhapatnam base, or, tsunami, which is technically not climate related, but you can see disasters have affected critical, military and other sorts of infrastructure across the region. Gender impacts is something that also, so you have gender impacts, particularly women who are affected with migration and and because of the loss of livelihood security particularly is important for all the whatever I mentioned, whether it's fisheries, agriculture, any of these sectors. Livelihood security is at the center of it also, particularly when women lose their livelihoods, they are forced into trafficking and many other such illegal activities, which obviously affect their well-being. And these are some of the kind of effects that also have on the communities, the disproportionate effects that you call, or intersectional sort of vulnerabilities that different communities have. So it's a wide gamut of vulnerabilities that we are looking at from different sectoral perspectives, community perspectives, or governmental or interstate perspectives. And many of these things will have to be addressed. I mean, of course, it's not an easy task, but also this is something that really poses systemic sort of risk across the region.
So that was quite an insightful personally for me also, and actually that paints a very vivid picture of the cascading threats from the food security or maybe to the displacement, whatever the problems which we are seeing. So now these certain areas also appears to be specially exposed. So now my question is to you that can we identify any emerging hotspots, like particularly in the Bay of Bengal, where climate risk and security vulnerabilities are particularly acute? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Myanmar particularly becomes like a hotspot because this is a country where, yes, we are seeing political instability. There's a lot of, instability on the ground, especially with groups that are clearly against the government that is in power right now. There is also the Rohingya refugee issue that is clearly affecting not just Myanmar but also Bangladesh. With Cox's Bazar is actually one of the hotspots, I would say, which emanates from Myanmar, of course, with the kind of political persecution that the community has faced. But what they are facing in Cox's Bazar is also something that we have to look at, because this region is also vulnerable to cyclones. It has seen high amounts of deforestation. There is a lack of resources, and there's also these internal tensions, in Bangladesh between the host communities or the local communities and the Rohingya refugees, because there is, of course, this kind of tension that Rohingya refugees get most of the UN aid or whatever that comes in response to like various disasters. Some of them have been moved to an island which is also vulnerable to cyclones. Now the Bangladesh government claims that they have refurbished the island and made sure that it would be less affected by cyclones, but there are a lot of concerns with regard to how that how the people were moved from Cox's Bazar to the island, and all these different questions become I mean, these are entangled in political questions as well. They are not entirely just climate security related, which is like purely based on how vulnerable communities are. Um, and I think these are hotspots, which I wouldn't say hotspot, but you can clearly say that these are areas where governance machinery doesn't seem to be working, or there seems to be a clear sort of like a wedge between the so-called governance machinery, which seems to be operating from the top, and the ground level realities where there's a clear disenchantment with the governance machinery. And then, yeah, I mentioned Sundarbans already. I think this is an area where you can clearly see that already communities are being forced to migrate. They are displaced by various kinds of disasters and also slow onset disasters. It's not always cyclones, right? So it's also like you have Lohachara, Goramara, some of these islands from where people have been forced to migrate already. These are like inhabited islands which have been affected a great deal. So what does that mean? Like, particularly when people are forced to migrate into interior areas, and how do you rehabilitate people in such a way that it's dignified rehabilitation? Human rights are, not violated. The rights of like children, for instance, education and cultural sort of affiliation or belongingness that many people have to the place or to the to the areas that they belong to, and then they are like uprooted from there. All these things will have to be considered, and Sundarbans particularly is a very crucial area as far as these changes are concerned. Um, but yeah, I mean, if you look at the overall picture, I mean, there are a lot of so-called hotspots where you can clearly see, like, these are like, issues like, for instance, even in Sri Lanka, you look at, I mean, like you have, I mean, this is a country that has seen civil war, ethnic conflict for a long time. And many of these issues are still unresolved. It's not like, everything is resolved. And, so these are issues that will have to be considered in the long term as to how, how there needs to be some form of, like trust and whatever, like peace building sort of initiatives also that would bring communities together, because something like climate insecurity requires a more like cooperative sort of where again all communities can come together. It cannot be always like a top down sort of way or top down sort of mechanism that would resolve these challenges in the long term.
So rightly said, because these hotspots are actually a wake-up call for the targeted action, which is required for the long run. So now moving ahead to the early warning and the disaster response system, because they are considered to be a very critical lifeline. So I want to ask you that how effective have disaster management and also this early warning system has been mitigating the climate-induced risk across the Bay of Bengal countries? Do you see any kind of effectiveness in that?
I mean, as I said already, like I think in terms of disaster management, all the countries in the region have come a long way. Not, all, I mean, especially India and Bangladesh. I wouldn't say as much say for Myanmar. Indonesia has, of course, faced so many disasters that they have built their governance, systems in such a way that they can respond to disasters more effectively. And if you look at the number of government agencies and the disaster management architecture, all the countries have a very clear sort of, architecture that deals with disaster management. I think the challenge lies in the fact that there is not, I mean, there is more emphasis being laid on disaster risk reduction. but it is still very early stages for all the countries, irrespective of all the disasters that countries have faced. I think because disaster risk reduction, it requires a mindset change in itself, that you're not like, just responding after a disaster. You need to already reduce the risk of disaster much before the disaster actually occurs. Because there's many disasters that you cannot stop anymore, like cyclones will happen, floods, coastal flooding is a major concern across the region. Um, or slow sort of disasters like sea level rise, coastal erosion. These are all disasters that are cannot be completely prevented. Now, how do you reduce the risk of these disasters is a question. Of course, the first thing that we need to all look at is that mitigation and reducing greenhouse gas emissions itself, but that requires a global effort. It's not enough if these countries alone are reducing their emissions. And in fact, the contribution of except India, if you look at the contribution of other and yeah, Indonesia of course has also high contribution. Others hardly contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously the priority is adaptation, and it's closely so adaptation, sustainable development goals, and disaster risk reduction go hand in hand. Ideally, in a governance system that should go hand in hand, but that is not what is going on. There is financial gaps because adaptation is still underfunded, and developing countries have been demanding more like loss and damage funds, which is more like disaster related, but also funds for adaptation. But if you look at the finance gap, it's just massive. UNEP has once again said that the finance gap is massive, and adaptation is still underfunded. So recently in the Belen summit, finally adaptation was made as a center point of discussion, and finally we have adaptation indicators, and we have at least some idea of okay, adaptation funding needs to be tripled or whatever, like some of these official statements have been made, but we have to wait and see how much money will actually come into the fund itself. But I think we also need models. We also need like long term. I'm not saying prediction is not possible, but at least some sort of scenario building that is required as far as long term preparedness is concerned. Because we never know how these changes are, particularly sea level rise, or many other changes could affect communities very rapidly in the long term. So that's where more emphasis needs to be laid. Also, I mean, resilience is something that can be very technocratic. Like you just think of, oh, with technologies we can resolve all the problems, but that's not all. You need social innovation. We need like more say gender sensitive, gender transformative sort of solutions, which can also help with targeted sort of ways or targeted solutions for specific communities. We need more education. We need like many other like innovations are required on the ground. And what we see is that over a period of time, disaster management exercises and disaster management responses have been quite effective in terms of reducing the number of deaths and rescue and relief operations. And in many other ways, this has been effective. Where the gap lies is disaster risk reduction, and that is where we need to focus more, because otherwise the disasters are just going to keep increasing in many ways. And how do we really address the kind of effects this is going to have on the resilience of communities, on infrastructure, on on societies, on economy, because this is affecting our GDP as well. So so this is something that needs to be also addressed in the long term.
So that's really a very balanced assessment. And finally, let's look at the diplomatic side of the equation. And as we know that the cooperation is very, very essential in the region if we have to manage these kind of a shared threats. So now my last question is also based on that. So how do you assess the effectiveness of climate diplomacy among Bay of Bengal countries, both bilaterally and through regional and multilateral forums?
Yeah, it's not much. It could be much more. I think overall, the climate diplomacy in South Asia, I'm coming to, before I come to Bay of Bengal, has been very weak, So even if you discount India, Pakistan, there's not been much climate diplomacy, even among other countries, that much, It's been very like nationally sort of oriented climate policies. And although there are so many, common challenges, if you just take the Hindu Kush Himalaya as an example, there's no way countries can really uh, address the climate security issues in this region without cooperating. But the fact is that there hasn't been much cooperation. Even scientific cooperation has been lacking. Why can't the scientific communities come together to address some of these? Like have regional climate models because this is important for the for long term preparedness. But that has not been happening as much. I mean, of course, it's happening at a very nascent level, but we need much more. There are, of course, regional organizations like BIMSTEC, which very lately they have been able to establish more and more like climate security or climate diplomacy mechanisms that would allow countries to cooperate with each other, particularly on sharing information, best practices. Also, mobilizing finance could be something that countries can do together. Technological innovation is something, R&D, research and development is something that can also be done. So there are many areas of cooperation that have been explored, particularly through regional organizations like BIMSTEC, or even like, you can look at Indian Ocean Rim Association, it's much bigger, but still you can see that this also has an influence on what happens in the Bay of Bengal region. So multilaterally, I would say these are some of the, like IONS is another one, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, but that purely focuses on like HADR exercises and, like again building sort of preparedness, particularly among the navies, having some sort of common understanding and standard operating procedures among friendly countries. That's also something we need to emphasize. It's not something that may involve everyone. So yet, we can see that some of these initiatives have sort of helped build some multilateral, setups to, deal with climate security. Bilaterally as well, there have been MOUs between India and Bangladesh. Some MOUs have been signed, including on the Sundarbans. But the problem is some of these have just remained on paper, right? So that's the problem. So you have a lot of agreements signed over a period of time, which is something, which with all agreements and treaties you have, which may be looking good on paper, but haven't really, haven't really expanded because why I'm saying expanded is because it cannot be just the MOU and just the kind of, whatever is written in that MOU, because these are the issues where you need joint management, like rivers, for instance. I don't see a way of, dealing with, say, Ganges Treaty without also addressing climate change. It's not like the treaty didn't allow for cooperation, but it needs to be interpreted in that way that there is an opportunity for cooperation that needs to be taken as well, because this is for long term security as well within the region. So bilaterally there are some agreements, MOUs, and also informal. There's a lot of informal engagements between the countries, particularly like the coast guards cooperate with each other on fisheries, or that's been happening as well for quite some time, but these are more informal engagements. But yeah, there is obviously scope for more. What I'm seeing is just like 1% of what can be achieved among the countries, which share a lot of common challenges, which have a lot of also kind of common weaknesses as well, or the governance gaps that countries have are quite similar in most of the countries. And so there is possibility of cooperation through multilateral or bilateral. I think multilateral would be something that can be expanded further. Of course, bilaterally, like for instance, as part of multilateral engagements like International Solar Alliance or Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, these are some of the mechanisms through which some cooperation is already happening. Um, but of course, these are very sector specific. Like, for instance, Solar Alliance is obviously looking at solar solutions in the countries that are part of the Solar Alliance, and that has been quite successful in mobilizing finances for these kind of solutions. It's important. It's affordable energy access is something that is critical for all the developing countries in the region. CDRI is another initiative which can be like something very forward looking. Again, it's more like research and development oriented, but it can also help with like technical solutions, social solutions that could help the countries to deal with climate related disasters, for instance. So there are these multilateral mechanisms that can already be leveraged, but and regional organizations that can also be leveraged. But I think for a long time, some of these mechanisms have sort of remained, I wouldn't say dormant, because of course, like BIMSTEC has remained dormant for much time, and then it's been revived, right? So it's obviously taking time for many of these working groups to sort of get more active and try to find those critical nodes that can be leveraged for enhancing cooperation. And climate change is a very very important issue, and it is a I would say it is a low hanging fruit as well as far as cooperation is concerned, because it's, in the sense, in terms of, political wrangling or any of that, this is something that affects, it's an existential issue for all the countries. So it's something that, even if it is linked with political issues, it needs, it's something that could bring countries together to find, if not common solutions, but at least like contextual solutions to the region itself. Like fisheries is one sector, agriculture is another sector. Um, migratory patterns which has not been addressed at all bilaterally between countries. There is no particular, like, I don't see a law coming up, but at least some sort of policy which can address, nationally, yes, but regionally, what are the policies that could address these migratory patterns? These are things that can be obviously discussed among the countries in greater detail, which I feel, is still at a very nascent stage.
So that's really a realistic yet hopeful view, because diplomacy has potential, and but it needs some stronger momentum also. So what an insightful discussion, Dr. Dhanashree. Thank you so much for your expert perspectives on climate change and non-traditional security threats in the Bay of Bengal. And to our listeners, we hope this episode of Reimagining the Bay of Bengal has deepened your understanding of how climate risks are basically reshaping the regional security. So stay tuned for more discussion on the forces shaping this vital region. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.